Our speaker today is Jim Chevalier.
Very good.
Well, that was hard. Jim Chevalier was a long-time history teacher at Glenbard North High School. He's a longtime Elgin resident, and he has a passion for something called the Black Hawk War. And he's going to share that with us, Jim.
I hope so, yes. When I was teaching and everything, that's fun. It's good to see all of you here, and we'll talk a little bit about something that occurred about 190 years ago, and not quite here, but a little west of here. Let me get into I'll get into that focus here. As it turns out, there was the last war fought in Illinois was fought between the Illinoisans and the other Illinoisans called the Black Hawk and his group, and they fought during the summer of 1832. It was not very good for the Indians. They ended up losing a lot of people and a lot of territories, it turns out. And what we'll do is we can go through it. I gave you a handout just to give you a sense of what was going on. One of those things is on the one side, which shows the kind of the buildings. At the top of that, it's Saukenhoff, which is the actual name of his village, which was located at where Rock Island is now located, or the Quad Cities, if you wish. And if you look at that picture, his huts or his village was very well organized, lined up. It actually shows approximately where we think Black Hawk may have lived in his area. And then, of course, it also shows things like the cemetery. They would bury their people on the side of the hillside that goes up to the Black Hawk Museum up there in Rock Island. And, of course, he was forced to leave this. As you'll find out, he was forced to leave it because they signed a treaty in 1804 that forced them to leave and go to the west side of the Mississippi River. And of course, you'll see there's some problems with that. But what we'll do is maybe show you a little bit of the Black Hawk. There it is. Black Hawk, of course, at the time of this war, when this war was fought, he was 65 years old. He doesn't live much longer. He lives until 1838, so he lives another maybe 6 years. But basically, he's a survivor of war. Not a lot of his people survived. In fact, maybe a total of 40 or 50 out of 1,000 that started with him coming across the Illinois River to come back into Illinois from what is now Iowa. So if we want to, we'll just show you a little bit. This particular video also focuses on Lincoln. You may remember that Lincoln fought in the Black Hawk War. And in fact, he was 23 years old. It was his, I think, only battle, or only war that he actually fought in, unless you count the Civil War as commander-in-chief. But he was a soldier, and he was very proud of the fact that he was made into a captain in the first group that he was in charge of. They voted in those days, the militia would vote and say, okay, who's going to be the leader of this group? And they voted in favor of Abraham Lincoln. He always said that was one of his favorite results of any election he ever was involved in. So yeah, he's the captain. And so they'll bring in things about Lincoln as well as Black Hawk. And actually we'll go for a few minutes and we'll show you the Lincoln connection. May want to make it longer.
Fighting Indians, but also appreciating what it is that the Indians have to teach about living on the land. In Lincoln's case, there's a historical basis for making that, for seeing that as part of his story. In the town that he grew up in, Pigeon Creek, there was an old Indian named Johnny Conklin, who was probably a survivor of the local tribes and would teach the local boys from so we know that Lincoln has some kind of friendly relationship with him because when Father was dying, he asked a young to write an epitaph for him. And the epitaph Lincoln writes is, "Here lies Johnny Conklin. Have mercy on his spirit, God, as he would have if he were God and you were Johnny Conklin." The story tells me a couple of things. First, that Lincoln is capable of forming a friendship across the color line. And second, look at the poem that he wrote. It involves a plea for God to have compassion on a human being by putting himself in a human being's place. To me, the essence of compassion, the essence of Lincoln compassion, is that ability to transcend, to feel across a line that is as sharp for his society as the division between the divine and the human, between the human and the animal, between black and white, between white and red. That's why in the novel I use his relationship with Potawatomi and his learning to hunt from the Potawatomi. And learning not to hunt from the Potawatomi, learning when not to kill, as a key to understanding, dramatizing this peculiar form of compassion which he has.
It would be a collective cultural memory, I suppose. This goes way back. Indian captivity stories were popular reading. If you want to get horrified, read Indian captivity. And these are the kinds of things that began to be published in the 17th century. So. There was very little disposition to feel any kind of charity for the Native Americans. Part of the American population that was really get settled. I think nobody was.
12, strongly, one was, to be sure, a bloody conflict. Racial hatred developed on both sides. What was particularly important in the white American Indian hate became commonplace. Now, by the 1830s and the 1840s, those days were, for the most part, long gone. But continuing episodes of Indian settler violence, like the Black Hawk War, worked to revive those feelings of hatred, and particularly of Indian hate. I think there was more exaggerated fear than there was real danger. It caused the mobilization of state militia forces, which then pulled men from places like Central Illinois into the struggle.
Twice. The first time is tragedy, the second time is comedy. There's a way in which the Black Hawk War is the Indian Wars of Daniel Boone and company, redone as a kind of black comedy. It's very much after the wave of settlement has passed over the Mississippi River. It's a very tawdry episode. The Sauk and Fox Indians were basically diddled out of the land.
In 1804, William Henry here.
Okay, we'll stop there. Basically, this person here, by the way, is William Henry Harrison, who will become the president of the United States, but he's the person who was the shortest acting president of the United States. He only lived for about a month after inauguration. But during this time, he was the governor of Illinois Territory. And back in the 1800s, he was pushed by, at that time, Jefferson, President Jefferson, and he wanted to make sure that there was plenty of room for more white settlers in Illinois Territory, Indiana Territory, that kind of stuff. And so he was encouraged to sign as many treaties as he could to have the Indians move on to west of the Mississippi River, since they had just acquired the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And so his mission basically was to try and get as much Indian land purchased or treated for the American settlers and have the Indians move farther west, west of the Mississippi. And so there's a treaty that is signed back in 1804, and it's believed that Harrison got the Indians drunk, so they would basically sign almost anything, not knowing what they were signing. In fact, later they claimed that they never really realized that all this was in there. And it turns out they gave away almost all of their land in Illinois and parts of Wisconsin And later they denied that this was in there, and it turns out that, wait a minute, it's right here in the paper. And of course, you must understand that the Indians have a tradition of oral history, whereas the whites would have written history, a little bit different twist on things. But William Henry Harrison has them sign a treaty, and it basically gives away all the land that they own or that they claim that the Indians used in Illinois. And of course, it also says in the treaty that they don't have to leave. They only have to leave when settlers start arriving. And so they thought, well, okay, they're not arriving. They didn't arrive until the 1820s. And so for a long period of time, they thought, well, this is just a bogus treaty and it's not going to work for anybody. And so they didn't realize that actually it was just a matter of time when they would have to leave and go to what is now Iowa. Okay. Well,
Ready?
yeah.
Person who was the Indiana territorial governor and also sort of the acting territorial governor of Upper Louisiana, was given an okay by Jefferson to try to procure land along the Mississippi River. The Sox owned a lot of that land, but he needed to have some leverage with the Sox. Luckily for him, there had recently been a Sauk warrior who had murdered a white man in Missouri, and the Sox had turned that warrior over, which was the customary thing at the time. U.S. officials would usually demand Indians who murdered whites be turned over to the territorial government for civil prosecution, which the Indians really didn't like because, of course, their system of justice was radically different. If you killed someone, you could cover the dead. You give their family enough money, enough presents, enough goods to basically cover that crime, and it was all forgotten. White justice didn't have that custom. An individual had to be held responsible for his or her actions and punished accordingly. The Sox wanted to free this young warrior who had killed a white man. Harrison immediately saw an opportunity. He told them, I'll release this young warrior, but first you have to sell some land. The funny thing about the 1804 treaty is there wasn't a treaty journal kept, which was a standard procedure at the time. So we really don't know what happened during the actual negotiation. There was legitimate Sauk and Fox leadership there, but they had not been given permission to sell land. In order for a tribe to sell land, the tribal councils had to approve it. They hadn't approved it. They had only given the delegation permission to go secure this young warrior. Another issue that you hear a lot about is that Harrison kept the entire delegation drunk most of the time, which was probably true. That was a very common tactic to leverage land from Indian. But later statements by the Sauk indicate that they knew that they had sold some land. The idea was they had sold relatively unused winter hunting grounds in Missouri. They had no idea that they had sold their lands all the way into Wisconsin, especially their lands along the Rock River Valley, which of course includes Saucon, the main Sauk village. Blackhawk believed rightly that the U.S. had swindled his tribe. And at the time, it wasn't a big deal in 1804 because the government said you can retain the land, you can live on the land until we have opened it up for settlement. Well, that happens in the late 1820s.
In the 1820s, American landowners began to sell Sauk lands and to compete with them for access to the land mines, and really to begin fighting them. So you get small scale violence between individual lead miners, white and Indian. By the mid to late 20s, you start to get more of farming firms here moving into the northern and western parts of the land. And that's where the pressure really is, because these farmers want to feel secure. They want to know that if tensions build up between natives and Indians, that it's not going to explode into violence that's going to result in the destruction of their farms and their families.
They cleared a space there, very full of fields and fertilized it and very productive. Suddenly the settlers began to move in, and it was land that was already cultivated, or the trees were cut and so forth. And I simply asked the Indian, development plan affected those of core here, and he was, well, economist, but it's not out over there. The next thing you know, they put the fence. The next thing they're building, really encroaching. When the Indians protested, and there were a couple of fist fights, no murders, but fist fights and things, and protests. Then you simply call the government, call the state of Illinois, basically. And you have governors like John Reynolds, who's called the old ranger, realizing that his political constituents demanded action and getting the United States to back them off across the river.
Okay, we'll stop there. You saw the governor of Illinois, John Reynolds. He is known as the Old Ranger because he fought as a ranger, a soldier in the War of 1812 in Illinois, Southern Illinois. You must remember that Southern Illinois was the place that most of the earliest settlers came, and they started moving farther and farther north. And so as they got closer and closer to Sauconnaug, which is at Rock Island, the Indians there, the Sauk Indians, are getting a little more upset. There's more and more whites coming into their land. They don't believe that they actually sold this land. They believe they were tricked. And so they are upset that they have more people coming into their space, claiming that this is now land for the white Americans. And so they get more and more upset over the years. And of course, there'll be more and more things like fistfights and other incidences between the Indians who live in that area and the whites who are moving in. The whites are moving in because this is really good land. It's basically where the Rock River and the Mississippi River meet. So it's very fertile land. And of course, it means there's plenty of crops, pasture land. The Indians were actually very prosperous. And they also had lead mines. The Indians developed lead mines a little bit north of there, up toward what is now Galena. And of course, they were first in using the lead and selling the lead. So they were very prosperous. They had horses, they had pasture land, they had cornfields, and they had lead. And so the Indians, the Sauks and the Fox, were extremely prosperous and worried that more and more white settlers would mean their prosperity and their way of life would change drastically, as it will, of course. Okay.
Ostensibly, you give them land, but it's never the same. It's not your home.
There's a real division within the Sac and Fox, and that by 1830, 1831, within a year or two of the Black Hawk War, most of the Sac and Fox have just recognized the radical. They know that they're not going to be able to stay on their traditional homelands. They have moved over into Iowa, and they are following the main body of chiefs who have all agreed that this is the necessary step. And the real leader of this group from the federal government's perspective is a man named Keokuk. The Black Hawk War was really triggered when Black Hawk and his followers, this mixed band of Sac and Fox, Kickapoos, Potawatomis, Winnebagos, came into Illinois from the west, back across the Mississippi River. He had agreed the previous summer, the summer of 1831, to stay west of the river and to stay under the control of Keokuk and the other civil leaders of his tribe. He had really gone back on his promise, his pledge that he had made. They had decided that this was intolerable, that he couldn't stand being under the control of his people. He hated, he viewed as having sold out his tribe. There was also a rumor circulating that the British would provide supplies and assistance. That if something happened and Black Hawk found himself in a conflict with the federal government, that British support would be forthcoming. Now, this was a lie, and it was very clearly a lie. And he would learn within the next few months that it was a lie. It was a lie that was told to Black Hawk by some of the very young chiefs in this band that he was really seen as the head of. And they told him this to stir him up, to get him to go back east, to get him to go live with the Winnebago prophet.
You know, the secret to that. They didn't want to leave, they were forced to leave at gunpoint. And the scene poem never came, they couldn't come for any of the other some 50 tribes. The people started to storm to them, and they were storming. They looked across the river to see the poem, they're going, they had a plan. Still going, and the whites was in there. So the second class lost their children and the old people died of starvation. He sent delegation across the river to ask if they could come and harvest them. No answer ever came. They had been promised new livestock, new cattle, horses, hogs, food, seed, corn, land, protection against the Western tribes where they were being put on the Western tribes' land. A lot of historians have thought, well, across the river because he wanted to make war against the whites. There's a problem with it. He crossed the river in April of 1832, not with warriors, but with warriors, old men, women, children. It was basically a portion of the Sauk and Fox tribe, to include also elements of the Kickapoos. He had absolutely no intention of actually making war. Second thing, though, he doesn't go to Saucon. He goes north to the Winnebago Potawatomi village, Wawakishan, also called the White Cloud, who was half Winnebago, half Sauk, and who, like many Indians of the time, was considered a prophet who had special.
Okay, this is a picture of White Cloud. White Cloud was the chief who was actually part Sauk and part Winnebago, and he has a town called Prophetstown, which is still there. Of course, Prophetstown is on the Rock River. He was considered to be the Winnebago prophet, and he kept telling Black Hawk and his group. The group was known as the British Band, by the way, because they had fought with the British against the Americans in the War of 1812. And in fact, Black Hawk was a general in that war on the side of the British. And so he felt that with support from the Winnebagos and support from the British, he thought he had support, and from the Potawatomis and from the Kickapoos, from a number of tribes, they could come back from Iowa and live along the Rock River, not necessarily his old village, the Sauconog village, but he could live along the Rock River with the Winnebagos who lived there as well. And so he's convinced that he comes across that river and he's going to live along the Rock River of Illinois. The treaty that he had signed a year earlier said that no, you can't come across to the east side of the the Mississippi River into Illinois. That he didn't understand that. He felt that it was only that he couldn't come back to his village. He had to go someplace, and he wanted to get away from Iowa, maybe a good reason, and of course go into the Rock River and go from there and become part of the Winnebagos. He brought women and children as well as warriors, not to fight a war, but to resettle in Illinois. Of course, they wouldn't let him because they thought he was now an invader into Illinois. And so once Governor Reynolds gets involved, he thinks we have to support the Americans who are living in what is now Rock Island. We have to support them, their voters. And so we'll have Black Hawk and his British band go back to Iowa or force them back to Iowa. And so he thought that he had support by coming here. He was not going to live in the original settlement at Sauconog. He was going to live along the Rock River, but it doesn't work out. Okay.
Divine gifts and could communicate with the spirit world. So most likely what he had hoped to do was go to the Winnebago Prophets Village, try to get other regional tribes to come to his standard, the Potawatomis along Lake Michigan, and what in Illinois, the Winnebago who lives in the Rock River Valley to the north, and what's the.
We'll pause it here real quick. This map shows basically the Rock River right here. His village originally was at the site where Rock River goes into the Mississippi, but he said, okay, I can't have that village, Sauconog. I'm going to go back up here along the Rock River and possibly into what is now Wisconsin. And he thought that would be fair. But because he comes across the river, it's considered to be an invasion by the whites. And so they begin to get very nervous about him. But he comes across the river. And of course, this is considered Sauk and Fox land as well as Winnebago land. And they thought that's acceptable. We should be there. We can live there. Why not? It's a free country. And so he saw it, but obviously Indians had a different set of values. So anyhow, he comes across the river, comes across the Mississippi River and goes up the Rock River for a while, and you'll see what happens. Okay.
The area of Madison all the way into the Fox River Valley. Basically just make a show of defiance, say, look, I'm here, I'm going, people are staying here. We want to renegotiate a treaty.
As soon as he crossed the river, the governor of Illinois cried up a gigantic lynch mob, which was called the militia, to kill the Indians.
Black Hawk had absolutely no intention of making war. His warriors were well disciplined. His people had plenty of food with them at the time. The Illinois volunteers, but the people who are sent after them, they're the ones who are going through farms, stealing livestock, ripping up potato fields, and just, wreaking havoc upon northern Illinois.
The frontiersmen, I don't think our whiskey was considerably different from ours. We don't want drunken soldiers. No, but then this was one of the basic inducements, and after all, Applejack cost less than probably 25 cents a gallon, and so one could indulge, and this was part of what they did with. Also, I suppose it had a lot to do with the fact that these people physically were susceptible to all kinds of plagues and agues and so forth, and whiskey was almost like a medicine. If that would be the case, we would have to provide whiskey.
They get a pinpoint of where Black Hawk is, and Governor John Reynolds of Longwood sending guys after him right now. It was really a rather rash move on Reynolds' part. Reynolds was not the sharpest pencil in the box, as they say. He didn't like Indians. He wanted to get all the Indians out of Illinois. He was determined to do as quickly as possible.
The great events of the war are the first battle, which is called Stillman's Run, because Stillman, Major Stillman, who commanded the troops, ran away.
News came to Atkinson's command that Black Hawk's British band was encamped near the Kishwaukee River at Old Man's Creek. Atkinson was a cautious general who moved his regular army soldiers deliberately. The Illinois militia, however, were signed up for 20-day terms of service and eager to see some action before being mustered out. The majority were young, single men, often shopkeepers or laborers. An Indian war held the possibility for social advancement. Under Major Isaiah Stillman, they raced ahead to confront.
Stop there. If you've been through Stillman Valley, this is the person it's named after. Isaiah Stillman was in charge of the forces that were the Illinois militia. He was actually a shopkeeper from just south of Peoria, a town called Canton, Illinois. But the good thing about the militia is they had horses. At that time, the United States military did not have cavalry. It's hard to believe. They got around either by walking or by riding boats. And so they had to use the militia to chase Indians or do whatever they needed to do in between the river valleys. And so these guys, who were mostly like weekend warriors and didn't really organize or weren't very well disciplined, they get together, they're told to follow up the Rock River and find Black Hawk so that he can be chased away or sent way back to Iowa. And of course, the general in charge, General Atkinson, is coming by boat. And guess what is slower, the boat or riding horses? The boats are much, much slower because they have all the equipment with them as well. And so the militia get way ahead of the general. And so when they now are told that Black Hawk is only a few miles away, they think that they can actually win this war very quickly as the Illinois militia. But something will happen with Isaiah Stillman's forces. Once again, very poorly disciplined. A lot of what they would drink would be rum or other liquor, whiskey, because it was actually considered safer than drinking water in those days. And so they were well liquored and, of course, ready to kill Indians whenever they found an Indian. Let's go on.
Black Hawk.
Still was a raucous kind of western.
who knew that he could parlay his ball in a force to the Indians into a military, into a military victory. And it served in good stead in politics in Illinois.
Those militia forces were notoriously poorly trained, unruly, lacking in discipline, and the result was that in their first encounter with the Indians, they were routed.
Black Hawk scouts told him of a large force of as many as 600 whites coming towards his camp. He had only 40 warriors with him, as most of the able-bodied males were out hunting in an attempt to feed the 800 or so women and children. His hopes that other Indian tribes would join and swell his resistance movement had failed to materialize. He sent 3 braves under a white flag to request a parley, intending to ask for safe conduct back to the western side of the Mississippi. 5 other Sauk went along to observe from a distance. The whites were surprised when the 3 came into camp. They joked and attempted to barter with the Sauks, but communication was limited. When they saw the observers, however, they suspected a trick, and a party of 20 men began shooting and chasing the Indians through the brush. Militiamen killed one of the 3 Indians with the truce flag. The retreating Sauks raced back to their own camp with news that the attempted parley had been violated. Black Hawk remembered. I immediately placed my men behind a cluster of bushes that we might have the first fire when they had approached close enough. They made a halt some distance from us. I gave another yell and ordered my brave warriors to charge upon them, expecting that they would all be killed. In the twilight, in a strange frontier far from home, the Sauk war cries chilled the inexperienced and, in a few cases, intoxicated militia. The bluster vanished, and the lead attackers turned and ran, some shouting that 1,000 savages were behind them. Soon the entire company was stumbling in terror through the darkness on the 25-mile trail back to Dixon's Ferry, leaving all their provisions behind. One man who had lost his parents to Indian fighting, Captain John G. Adams, tried to single-handedly stop the rush of Indian pursuers and protect the chaotic retreat. He was soon shot down and beheaded. A monument stands today in commemoration of the one act of heroism in an otherwise disastrous day for the U.S. military that would send shockwaves across the country.
Go back to a little bit so you get the picture.
Black Hawk recalled.
Right, it's up there. As it turned out, if you've been to Stillman Valley, obviously that water tower was still there. And there's a memorial that was built in the early 1900s to the soldiers who died at Stillman's Run. There were about 12 of them that died. And one of them was this person, Adams, who stopped and fought them. But you must understand that they were panicked. And the sun was going down at that time. So when these 3 Indian warriors to parley with the militia come in, first off, they can't speak each other's languages, so there's no English or translation of any kind. And they bring with them a white flag. But it turned out that night, that as the sun is going down, there's a full moon coming up. And so it's believed that some of the soldiers, some of the militia soldiers, thought that it was a red flag because of the darkness of that particular time, like sunset. And so it was thought to be a red flag, meaning that they were ready to fight us. And of course, the militia run after them. And then when they start getting shot at, they said, that's enough of this. They go the other way and say that there's 1,000 warriors that are after us. We have to get out of here and go to Dixon. And so they do what's called the Stillman Run. They run back to Dixon and tell people that they're being chased by 1,000 warriors under Black Hawk. And of course, it was only about 40, as it turned out. So as it turned out then, Black Hawk was totally surprised. He thought that all of his warriors would be killed, that this would just be a massacre by the militia. It turned out to be a battle that was won by Black Hawk. He was so surprised that they actually won this, They did lose some Indians, warriors, and of course, the whites also lost people as well. And once you get a battle in which both sides have casualties or losses, it's very difficult to go back to a peace treaty or very difficult to go back to things as they were. And so this first battle fought in Illinois, and actually probably the last battle fought in Illinois, because he will leave with his band and go farther north into what is now Wisconsin. And the militia, they just said, that's enough of this, we're going home. So that's not Black Hawk at all. As it turns out, the militia decided to leave, and they tried to get as many of the militia to stay as possible, but because they were really undisciplined and panicked, very few of them stayed. So they had to reorganize. One of the persons who did stay was the Captain Abraham Lincoln, who now will be formed into another company as a private. He'll be a private Lincoln in another company. But he decides to stay. But they only have about 100 soldiers that stayed. All the rest of them took off for the hills and went back home and said, we don't need to get shot at. And so the first battle is a total loss by the white Americans. And of course, Black Hawk now realizes he's not going to be able to surrender easily because now people on both sides have died. Okay.
We attacked him in the prairie with a few bushes between us about sundown, and I expected that my whole party would be killed. I never was so much surprised in all the fighting I have seen, knowing too that the Americans generally shoot well, as I was to see this army of several hundreds retreating without showing fight.
They awaited the arrival of Federal troops before those Indians could be taken care of. Fortunately, the way they were taken care of was that they were massacred. So what begins as tragic comedy ends as tragedy in the Black Hawk War.
Lincoln was there. Only when he's in the US Congress, he's making this sort of tongue-in-cheek speech about his service in the Black Hawk War. He admits, he said, I wasn't Stephen's defeat when I saw the panel being short after. He was part of the army that was sent forward to lead it in during the game.
In all, 12 militiamen were killed, and perhaps 5 saw. As was the practice, the white bodies were scalped and mutilated. Abraham Lincoln reportedly viewed the carnage after Stone's Run, as it came to be known. He also saw the aftermath of another massacre at Kellogg's Grove, about which he wrote, I remember just how those men looked. The red light of the morning sun was streaming upon them as they lay heads toward us on the ground. Every man had a round red spot on top of his head, about as big as $1, where the Redskins had taken his scalp. It was frightful, but it was grotesque, and the red sunlight seemed to paint everything all over.
Okay, we'll stop there briefly. As it turns out, the Indians will not just kill their opponents, but they will chop them to pieces. The reason they do that is that they believe that in the spirit world, that they will run into these same opponents again. And so the only way to prevent them from having a problem in the spirit world is to chop up the people they have just killed. They will, of course, take scalps as a trophy, but they will also behead them, chop off legs and arms and things of that type. And so it's seen as being really savagery on the part of the Indians. But for the Indians, it makes sense. They don't want to, if they end up in the spirit world, face this person again. And if they do face him again, now that person doesn't have his arms. And so they believe that they'll be safe in the spirit world. So it makes sense to them, but to the Americans, it looks as if they're just being mean because they chop everybody up. And women and children as well. Okay.
Remember that one man had buckskin breeches on.
The unit that Lincoln was with never caught up with the enemy. They never got to fight. And you can imagine that this is really why they went out. They went out because they wanted to fight.
He doesn't say a great deal, but he does say some really interesting things. He says, for example, that being elected captain gave him more satisfaction than anything that had ever happened to him before or since. So it had to be his first big thrill.
To me, it's a war of very few battles, a war primarily of pursuit, as Black Hawk's band takes off up the Rock River, then into Wisconsin, through.
Stop there. You still have that flyer. There's a map on the back. Let me just kind of give you a little history of that. If you look at the Rock River just south of where Rockford is, you'll find Stillman's Run battle site. And of course, after this, Black Hawk realizes that he can't surrender easily. He's going to have to just get out of there. And so he goes northward into Wisconsin, and the militia on horses and the United States military on boats will pursue him up into Wisconsin. They get reorganized into different groups and different actions. They actually had more militia come northward from southern Illinois, where almost all Illinoisans live at that time. They come north, and so he has a new group of soldiers, but it takes about 2 weeks or 3 weeks to get them organized again. And so when they now pursue Black Hawk and his British band into Wisconsin, it's July. The first battle took place in May. And so it's really hard to find them. And so they go to what is now Lake Koshkonong. And of course, try to find him. They think he's in the area. And they have guides, Indian guides, who are Winnebago. And the Winnebagos actually are trying to mislead the military. They're trying to let Black Hawk get out of there and go to Iowa. So the Winnebago keeps saying, oh, he's farther north, he's farther north, when in fact he was actually going a different direction. Later, the Winnebagos, they will find out that they were lying to the military. And of course, that will cost them territory, because they, once the war is over, the losers end up getting more territory taken from them. But anyhow, this, if you look at that, you'll see the next big battle, I think it's on there. It shows that they will pursue him all the way up to what is now Fort Atkinson, named after General Atkinson. And they will go to a place just north of Madison called the Battle of Wisconsin Heights. And that's in late July when they finally catch up to Black Hawk. It takes a long time because they're being misled by their Winnebago guides, and Black Hawk is still trying to get over to Iowa. But they have a battle, and in that battle, the Black Hawk is fortunate in not losing, because now they go across the Wisconsin River, and the pursuing militia can't go across the river easily, and so they stop at that battle. A number of Indians and one soldier is killed in the Battle of Wisconsin Heights. But it shows that now the militia are reorganized, ready to fight for real. And of course, they break off the battle because Black Hawk and his men, women, and children all go across the Wisconsin River, and they can't pursue them. It gets to be sundown, and they decide, okay, let them go for now. We'll catch up to them later. And so they stop, and then they reorganize at a place called Blue Mounds in Wisconsin, Fort Blue Mounds. And of course, you'll see that they get reorganized again under Atkinson, and they will chase them all the way up to the Bad Axe River, which is where they will catch up with them. And we'll go a little farther.
Swamps of southeastern Wisconsin, and tries to make its way to the Mississippi, but has to do so in a roundabout way that they won't walk right into the teeth of an Illinois militia force or a federal army.
The Mississippi is a bit different than Wisconsin, much faster river, much bigger river. And by this time, Atkinson is pinpointed exactly where the British band is.
The last battle of FedEx.
It's dedicated to the western side, away from white settlements. Peace might be arranged.
So now Atchison and his troops reorganized are pursuing Black Hawk. They can find them easily because now there's a trail of dead bodies, dead horses that Black Hawk has to leave behind. They're out of food, they can't get food easily, so they kill their horses and eat them. The ones who were wounded at the Battle of Wisconsin Heights, north of Madison, some of them will die en route. They're going into the hilliest part of Wisconsin, the driftless area, between Madison and Mississippi River. And so Black Hawk by this time thinks that the Army is too far behind him. He doesn't have to worry about them as much. And so he doesn't go as fast, but he also has a lot of women, children, and wounded warriors to contend with and try to get to the Mississippi and get to the west side of the Mississippi. And so he doesn't go quite as fast, but the Army is now reorganized and ready to follow this trail of dead horses, dead bodies, and they're ready to pounce on Black Hawk and teach him a lesson, as they put it. And that lesson will be at the mouth of the Bad Axe River. You can probably
Should
push
back
it
up
up.
or go?
No, England part.
Oh, here?
Okay, right there. It's going good.
What was left of the British band was virtually annihilated. The United States supplied the Sioux with guns to kill the women and children as they came across the river. The women and children tried to build rafts to get across the river. The young warriors in the river waiting for them. As these rafts, women and children came out into the river, the warriors leading these rafts up. The two women and children made it to the other side of the John Hopkins in the sea. Regulars man to get across the Mississippi, and the Sioux hunted them down. The Menominee is also very.
Okay, we'll stop there. The Battle of Bad Axe River is basically, basically a massacre of what's left of Black Hawk's group. He tried to convince them to go farther north up toward the Chippewa country of northern Wisconsin, up past the Wisconsin Dells. He tries to convince them to do that. His local family decides to go that direction, and so he survives. But many of the Indians who try to go across the Mississippi River are killed. If they do make it on the other side, the military has already asked the Sioux Indians, who are not friends with the Sauk Indians, to pursue any survivors. And so they pursue any of the survivors who made it to the west side of the Mississippi River. They do kill almost 70 more of the Sauk Indians and capture another 40 or so. In that battle of Bad Axe, it's believed that there were about 40, mostly women and children, that survived. And that's it. Out of the original number that Black Hawk had, it's believed to be well more than 1,000. Now, some of them will leave and go off on their own, so not all of them were killed. But at the Battle of Bad Axe, it's believed at least 400 Indians were killed. And also, of course, the military, some of them were killed as well. Somewhere in the vicinity of maybe 10 or 12 military are killed at the Battle of Bad Axe. This is basically the end of the war, but we still have Black Hawk out there. He's still somewhere. Maybe just go a little farther and we'll stop.
The sacrifice and they can come down.
Black Hawk's escape path took him into northern Wisconsin through Winnebago land. While many of the Winnebago were sympathetic to Black Hawk's dream of Indian resistance to white settlement, they were under heavy pressure from the U.S. government to produce Black Hawk or be seen as collaborators. 10 Winnebagos found Black Hawk and persuaded him to surrender. But first, Winnebago women sewed him a new white deerskin uniform so that proper appearances could be presented when he was turned over to American authorities at Prairie du Chien.
He's in prison down in Jefferson Barracks, which is the present day St. Louis, and he's kept.
Okay, he's going to go to Prairie du Chien. There's a fortress there, Fort Armstrong. No, it's and there's a fortress there where he surrenders in his new white buckskin clothing. He surrenders, along with a few of the other leaders that were with him. And of course, that's basically the end of the war. There is no more war to be fought, since now we have the leader of the tribe, the British band,
He is sent down to St. Louis, and there's a place down there called Jefferson Barracks. He will be put in prison for about a year, actually with a ball and chain, which of course is a real insult to him. He's thinking, I surrendered, I said I would not fight anymore, but they still put him in a ball and chain. About a year later, his tribe, what's left of the tribe, the other half of the tribe that didn't fight the war, are in Iowa under other leaders. And they said, can you release him? And they said, we'll release him, but he has to take a tour of American cities on the East Coast. And so he goes to Washington, D.C. He meets with Andrew Jackson. And then he is, from there, he's given a tour of Eastern cities, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. And he's amazed at how many whites there are in general. He never realized that the population was that big. And he promises not to go to war again. But he's put under the thumb of one of the leaders of the Sauk tribe by the name of Keokuk, who will supervise him for the rest of his days. Okay, that's basically the war. But what it does also is that now all of this land is now open. There's nobody here. And the Potawatomi and the Winnebago who helped him are told they have to leave also because they helped him. And so this land is now basically wide open. And the important thing about that is that now there are more and more settlers, but more and more of the settlers are coming from New England. They're coming from the northern part of the United States, not states that have slavery. So they come in larger numbers because after all, in 1825, the Erie Canal allows them to come north. There's open space. There's like nobody here, hardly anybody here. It's a few Potawatomi. And so they begin to move into this territory. Galena ends up being the biggest town in Illinois at the time. I have a map of Chicago. If you get a chance to take a look at it. It's a map of Chicago a year after the war, 1833. And the number of people who live in Chicago is 350 people. That's it. And also, if you look closely, you'll see that, for example, they have a stagecoach that runs from Michigan to Chicago once a week to deliver mail. So you get your mail once a week. And then other places, almost all of the loop area, the streets like Dearborn and State Street and all of those are in existence back in 1833. Black Hawk will go into Iowa to live. Most of the tribe later will be sent farther west, just like most of the Indians. Then they'll say, okay, let's have another treaty. We'll take this half of Iowa. You have to go to Nebraska. And then when they get to Nebraska, they said, oh, you have to go to Kansas. And then eventually they end up in Oklahoma. So most of the Sauk Indians are the ancestor of the ones who are related to Black Hawk live in Oklahoma now. Questions? I didn't want to go any farther than an hour. Yes.
Just a little idea of Black Hawk's age. We know when he was born and how long we lived after the.
He only lived until 1838. But he was kind of under the thumb of Keokuk, who was the tribal leader at that time of the surviving Sauk Indians. And he didn't like Keokuk. It's a little bit like being on parole, but you're under home confinement. But he was. He also when he dies, they decide to put his body into a regular grave. His body is stolen. And they send him to somebody tries to sell parts of his body. They put him in a museum in Burlington, Iowa. The museum burns to the ground, and so Black Hawk's, even his bones are gone. He's not with us.
In some of the pictures, he looks quite old.
He was 65 at the time of the war. Yeah, it was quite old. Well, for the times, you must understand that people didn't really live long. 65 was pretty long. And considering that he also lived basically outdoors. I mean, his whole life he was outdoors. And he was a warrior. It's known to have killed at least 20 men. Almost all of them were Indians, of course. But much of the warfare at that time was between Indian tribes. And the American government tried to make sure that they didn't fight very much against each other. They tried to keep the peace between Indian tribes as good as they could. But the best solution that people like Jackson and others came up with is to keep them moving west, whether it's the Trail of Tears by the Cherokee or any trail going farther west. And so Oklahoma gets to be the place where they end up for many of the tribes, including the Sauk tribe. Although there is a place in Iowa that's kind of between Cedar Rapids and Des Moines that is a small reservation of Sauk and Fox Indians. Oh, question? I'm sorry.
Did he have surviving children?
Yes, he did. He had one of his sons and his daughter died when they were teenagers, actually. And for 5 years, he blackened his face as a sign of mourning and didn't eat very much except some food at lunchtime. So for 5 years, he mourned his 2 children that did die in early age, but he had 2 sons that survived. But I'm not sure, there's no real record of what happened to them except they survived. Okay, go ahead.
After they chopped up all these bodies,
Mhm.
so that Indians, when they met them in the spirit world,
Right.
the Indians weren't scared because everybody was bald.
Well, they would meet up with them, but like they might be beheaded. You know, so it's like, you know, if your opponent in the spirit world is beheaded, what's he going to do to you? I mean, especially if you have all your faculties. But also, you must remember that warriors at that time, it was a sign of manhood to actually scalp somebody. In fact, you weren't considered to be a full member of the tribe if you were a male, that is, if you didn't actually kill and scalp somebody. And Black Hawk, of course, did that when he was probably about 14 or 15 was his first person that he killed, but it would be like an Osage tribe from Missouri that they fought against. And so it was considered to be kind of like what you had to do as a young man was to kill somebody and prove it by bringing their scalp. They showed a picture up here, kind of a drawing of Indian Creek Massacre, they called it. Indian Creek is just north of Ottawa, maybe about 15 miles. There was a group of early settlers that lived there, and the early settlers decided to dam the river, the Indian Creek. It leads into the Fox River. And they dammed the river so they could have like a mill. They would make a mill. Well, because they dammed the river, the fish couldn't go up that river anymore to the Indian village, which was about 10 miles up the river. And so the Indians didn't get fish for a while. So when Black Hawk fights that first battle at Silman's Run, they decide, why not take revenge? And so they go to this mill on Indian Creek and they kill 15 people, men, women, and children. Some of the boys who were out in the field escape, but they're all buried there, and they chop them up. Yes.
I don't recall exactly where I heard it, but I seem to recall somebody pointing out that the practice of scalping was introduced to the Indians, that they weren't the ones who came up with that.
I'm not sure. I would doubt that. Because they needed to prove their manhood, and one way to do that was to kill a warrior from another tribe. But you had to prove that, and then they would have a scalp dance, and now you'd be honored as a person who is a real warrior because you actually killed somebody.
So I don't recall where I heard it, but
Yeah.
some history program that mentioned that.
I would doubt that, especially in the Midwest.
Taught the practice.
Yeah, but young men had to, it was like, you know, getting your driver's license. You had to kill somebody and have a scalp. Yes.
The Lincoln never saw any bad.
No, he did see those dead bodies that were scalped, and he buried them.
I think I remember him later in life, making some quote about he battled mosquitoes.
Yes, he said the only blood that he had to give up was from mosquitoes.
Yeah, okay.
That was it.
Yeah.
So he fought in the war and gave up some blood, but to mosquitoes. But you must understand also that almost all the men who did fight in that war looked for political gain as a possibility, or like they'd be the mayor of their town, or they'd be a new congressman or something. So it was considered the thing to do would be to be in the militia or be in the military as a way of advancing yourself. And so going to war, it was like, okay, we can go out and shoot some Indians and become the mayor of the town later. Well, thank you for being so attentive. Sorry, there had to be so many pictures here, but what you saw was actually happened.
More
Sorry, one more question. Go ahead. He was 23.
23. Was he in charge of the?
He was in charge of the first company. They voted him captain. But then after Sillin's run, when most of the militia ran away, he stayed and was reorganized as a private in another company. And he never moved on further than that. He actually only fought until July 10th of that year because they were running so low on food that General Atchison said, you guys have to go home because we don't have enough food for you. So go home. And he was one of the ones who had to go home. The day after he left, when he left the next morning, he found out that his horse had been stolen. So he didn't have a horse to go. He had to walk back until they got to about the Rockford area. And then he got a hold of a canoe or a raft and was able to go down to Springfield eventually. It took him a while to get there. And by the way, he was running for Congress, but he lost the election at that time. All right. Well,
All right,
thanks for
thank you, Jim. Very interesting.